I have an entire chapter that just breaks out every single puzzle and game connection in any of his musical shows. So there's a tremendous amount. But what I will share, which was quite a surprise to me, some of you who are Sondheim fans might have or know about his 2-book collection of his annotated lyrics. And remarkably, he has a lot of obscure stuff in it, Juvenilia in it, and Parodies in it. But there are 2 songs he wrote that are not in it. And they're not obscure from the 50s. They're from the 1990s. And there was, as you all probably know, many of his shows are collections of his songs thematically connected somehow. People started doing it in the 70s, and they kept coming with more and more ways to put them together. And one of them that was done in the 90s was created in London. And then when it was brought to America, they changed the setting somewhat. So now you're in New York City with people at a party. And there are 2 songs where they play games. For each of the songs, he took one of his songs, like one's the gun song, for example, from Assassins, and he wrote different lyrics, parodying himself. But what the lyrics are about is playing the games he played in the 60s. One of the games, for example, was called Hostilities, and the lyrics are about playing hostilities. He then has the characters in the song playing the games he used to play, his parlor games in the 60s. That's the most direct collection, where he actually wrote the lyrics for his characters to play the games he and his friends played decades earlier. And yet, it's not in his book. He must have chosen that. I don't know why. So, a long answer. Excellent question. I've been working on the project for 2.5 years, and getting to understand and getting deep into someone who thought so differently from the people around him, but wanted to bring them along, didn't isolate himself from them, even if it was frustrating at times, and wanted to challenge everyone to be the best they could be, has been inspiring for me to think about all of the works where I have my own particular areas of expertise. And how do I share that with others? How do I bring them into that process? How do I support everyone else to be their most excellent selves? Most of the people who he collaborated with, I don't mean musically, but on his games and puzzles, who I had a chance to interview, often repeated the same concept, that he could have dumbed it down for them, could have dumbed it down for the final audiences, like for treasure hunts, for example, but that he didn't do that, that he had high expectations for people, but that he didn't set them up to fail. He set them up to succeed. He gave them all the information they needed to figure it out, and then would give them scaffolding to bring them along, because he knew that these tools were necessary in game design, just as tools are necessary in musical theater. If you haven't heard him speak about it yet, Sondheim will speak about how when someone's listening to something in musical theater, you have to make it really clear, because they're only going to get it once, and it has to be able to be parsed very fast. So do you repeat it? What are the skills that he gets to use as a lyricist to make sure you get it, which is very different than reading poetry on a page, for example, which you can go back and reread. He had different sets of skills for game design, and he used them to bring people along and keep them engaged. And so for me, that's been really inspiring to get to work deep for 2.5 years with both a mind and a personality who treated people with such generosity. If we were together and we were going to play a game, there's nothing I'd enjoy more than going to a really well-designed escape room. As did Sondheim. Escape rooms came to America in the teens. I want to say they started in New York. They might have started in San Francisco, but they were in New York very soon after, if they didn't start here. And Sondheim was one of the first people to go. And if you don't know anything about him, it seems surprising. Let me do the math here. He was born in 1930. So he's now in his 80s. He's this guy in his early 80s who's, I got to go to an escape room. You got to come with me. But if you've learned what I've learned and what I've shared with you guys about all the things he loved, imagine how much work he had to put in, organizing his friends, designing some parlor games or adapting some parlor games for his house, creating these elaborate treasure hunts where you had to solve puzzles and move around a space. He can now pay someone, and they did it for him. It was everything he loved to do, with word games, physical puzzles, mapping challenges to physical spaces. It was everything in one space. And so I love escape rooms for that too. And because of what they do for the people you're with, you get to see people being excellent. You get to learn where their strengths are. You get to see where your challenges are also. It forces you to be humble. It's a growing experience. And you have to learn how to not yell at each other for an hour and how to collaborate. If you're willing to do it more than once and it works, it's great bonding. For all those reasons and more, I love escape rooms. And bringing it back to Sondheim, the first treasure hunt he did was in 1968 with Anthony Perkins, and it was a treasure hunt for theater friends around New York City. And one of the puzzles used a popular song sung by Frank Sinatra at the time, and it was just played without the music. And it was played over a certain moment that said a time. The lyrics were about 2:45. And people who solved it at the time realized, oh, 2:45, that's 2:45. They had to find addresses. Oh, so the next address is the one that's 245, right? And this got shared throughout the theater community, and it became like a thing that was known about Sondheim. Like, people didn't know much about puzzles and games, but people who knew anything knew he did this treasure hunt with Anthony Perkins. It was on Halloween, and there was this puzzle. In the teens, someone who knew Stephen Sondheim knew someone designing an escape room and told him about this. And he goes, oh, that's great. And so he incorporated it into his escape room, playing that song and the clue being 245. And then a year later, guess who comes in as a client? Stephen Sondheim, having no idea that he was going to see his puzzle from 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 40 years earlier, incorporated into the very escape room that he was solving. And the person who was, if you don't know how escape rooms work, someone's the person giving you clues, and they can see what's going on, they can hear everything. And they took notes because they weren't just the person doing that. This one also had actors in it. They were giving notes just as you would with a show to the actors afterwards. And so he has all of his notes, and he shared with me exactly what happened when Sondheim walked in the room and heard the song. And he said he just got the biggest smile on his face. He recognized it. He knew what it was and where it came from. Great question. We have 4 minutes. Is that right, Natalie? All right. So I'll give the short answer. I'm a game designer, and I love Sondheim, right? So when I learned through reading a number of books about his life that he was interested in game design, I was intrigued. In one book, it said that in the early 80s, after Merrily flopped, that he wanted to leave musical theater and go into video game design. It's the early 80s. People didn't aspire to go into video game design. We're talking about Pac-Man and Donkey Kong, which are amazing, but that wasn't a popular, culturally accepted thing to do. Now, how can this possibly be? And so when I started digging into that, I learned that, in fact, he was the puzzle editor for New York Magazine for 2 years when it was founded in the late 60s. I didn't know that. I found out that he designed board games for his friends, elaborate games, that he did treasure hunts. The more I learned, the more I found out that this was not just an interest that Sondheim had. It was a major part of his life. As I write in the book, if he had written nothing in musical theater, when he passed away in 2021, the New York Times would have written an obituary about him because of the impact he had on puzzles in America, because he brought cryptic crosswords from England to America. When I saw how much was at the top of that iceberg, but was unknown, and that the only way to find it was to talk to the people who were there in the room, who played the games with him, who collaborated with him in designing them, who asked them to make them for him, I thought, ooh, that's fascinating. I love uncovering research like this that required people to open up to me and trust me to own those stories, and then me to have that challenge, that puzzling challenge of putting all those pieces together. What does it tell us about Stephen Sondheim? What does it tell us about puzzles and game design? And how do we elaborate this and tell it in a way of interest to people who aren't just interested in Sondheim or puzzles and games, but are interested in this larger way that we can understand someone's life from a ludological perspective, from a gaming perspective, and how could it teach us something that we can apply in our own lives?